This kind of styling from the middle 1960s was thought by many to be the end of the road for product design. The battle between price and style had ended, and price had won. The beautiful and imaginative designs of just a few years earlier were gone, and this took its place. Until... Today we're looking at the design revival around 1970 that saved consumer product design. This Zenith radio from 1965 is where most radio collectors I know draw the line. They're not interested in much of anything newer than this, and that's because most mid-60s radios looked like this, dull, plain, and all too much alike. In hindsight, it's obvious that the radios had been competing on price rather than styling. Boxy, unadorned products were cheaper to make, and it showed. But a styling revival began to emerge in the late 1960s, which I call the Panapet Era. This is a Panapet, a Panasonic radio otherwise known as the model R70. It's a radio sometimes inelegantly referred to as a ball and chain, and Panasonic even called it that in advertising. A badge on the radio says Panapet 70. But strangely, I can't seem to find the Panapet name anywhere else on the radio, the box, the instructions, or any of the other papers that came with this game-changing little radio. Until the late 1960s, Panasonic product design was fairly austere, attractive and well-built, but pretty serious-looking, and usually black. The Panapet, introduced in 1970, was all about fun. It wasn't pocket size, but then it wasn't intended to go in a pocket. It was intended to be swung around and admired, like, say, Ginger Rogers. The Panasonic Era I might have named after this Panasonic radio, released about the same time, and known as the Tootaloop. But let's not be silly. Panapet Era I can say without cringing. These Tootaloop radios could be carried around your wrist, or stood up on any kind of surface in any number of ways. Like the Panapet, they came in bright, unmuted colors, then associated with current trends in pop art. The Tootaloop Model R72 is one of the very few consumer products actually credited to a designer, one J.M. Willman. Why does the name of a Panasonic radio get to define an entire era? Well, look at this 1973 ad. As you can see, it's hard to imagine anyone who did more to bring style back into product design after the stale 60s than Panasonic, then still officially known as Matsushita Electric. Things were happening in a big way at Matsushita in 1970 and 71. You can still see their earlier Panasonic logo and lettering style on the Panapet box. On this 1971 ad, the logo is gone, but the lettering remains the same. Later in 1971, they changed that logo lettering to this, pretty much the same as still used today. And that's the logo we see in this 1972 ad for the Tootaloop, along with their slogan, "Just slightly ahead of our time." I think this earlier ad teaches us something else that is otherwise undocumented. We see the Panapet featured in this ad, but not the Tootaloop. and this strongly suggests which came first. There are a lot of great-looking radios in this 1971 ad as the Panapet Era unfolds, and there are even more in the 1973 ad as Panasonic extends their commitment to fresh and fun design to include other products such as record players and cassette tape recorders. They called the product line the Crazy Color Portables, and gave the radios names like the Monster Mug and the Rolling Tone. The record player gets dubbed the Funny Graph. Yes, indeed, things were happening in a big way at Panasonic. There are collectors who collect 1970s things, artifacts of that orange and avocado polyester decade, and the Panasonic radios are often found in those collections. But the radio guys, the transistor radio collectors I know, shun anything newer than 1965, with very few exceptions. Unlike them, I never drew the line at 1965. Oh, I could see the difference. I just didn't want to give up the pursuit of interesting radios. And so I kept at it, acquiring the obviously collectible Panasonics and discovering many other hidden gems from the Panapet era. In the mid to late 1960s, not only were radio designs mostly dull, the whole idea of a transistor radio was getting kind of passé. The cooler kids had cars and 4-track stereo players in those cars. What was a transistor radio good for? The ball game, I guess, or Bobby Sherman. Well, there were a lot of people who still wanted to hear Bobby Sherman very much, and Donny Osmond, and Cher, and the Jackson 5. The music was still fun for them, but the radio designs sure weren't. There were others besides Panasonic seeking to replace the boxy look and come up with the next big thing in radios. There were novelty shapes on offer from these other players, and they sold fairly well, but many people just wanted a pocket transistor radio, not a novelty or a conversation piece like this, but a radio that would fit in your pocket and yet have some style. Did that seem like too much to ask? Radios like this Channel Master were the answer. It's a 5-transistor from around 1973-ish, and is a very good-looking period piece. It's from Hong Kong. The vinyl strap obviates the need for a leather case, and indeed in this era straps largely replaced cases. Many users saw the trade of case for strap as a positive thing, finally resolving the question of whether to keep a radio in its case or not. With no case, problem solved. Now, I'd place this Aristo a little bit earlier on the timeline than the Channel Master. It still has many of the design details of earlier radios, like the silver trim around the edges, and it's boxy like those earlier radios. But as you can see, it's making a valiant attempt to break free of that oppressive plainness usually associated with the boxy types. These sharp radios may have preceded the Panapet era by a bit, which makes them pioneers in the return of the cool-looking pocket transistor radio. There's a video on this channel all about them, and this Craig has its own video too. Imagine if this thing were yellow. Well, here's one that is. It's a radio that also has its own video on this channel, the RCA RZG343 from around 1970 that RCA calls the color radio. Turning the wrist strap into a fashion accessory, this radio came with 2 different interchangeable straps. Hitachi stepped up their game, too, with this KH900 model. 4-Star, whoever they were, came up with this radio that reminds me of a Norelco rotary head shaver. And here's the... well, it's hard to know what to call this. It's a Lloyd's or Fabuloids, and the name on it is Hippie. Or is it Flippy? Nowhere does this name appear in normal type, so I can't be sure. But I think it's Hippie. This radio came in 3 versions. The Serape model, on which it says Hipster, or is it Flipster? The checkerboard model, also called Hipster, and this Hippie one, which is also called Bubbles. You got all that? And Sony wasn't just sitting around, letting all the others have the fun. They did this, and like a lot of things Sony did, this TR-4100 from 1972 was widely copied by other companies, mostly in Hong Kong, companies with neither imagination nor shame. Like the Ladybug, the Hamburger, and the RCA Floater, this Magnavox is not a pocket radio, and is instead primarily a novelty, as I would define it. While many radios here in this video have some novelty characteristics, they are still clearly radios to be used and carried around as radios. This Magnavox space capsule is better suited to sitting on a desk as a conversation piece, as of course is this one, the terrific balance-type fashion radio from JVC, the Japanese Victor Company. Radio Shack stores offered this Love radio with the Realistic brand on it. It's made in Korea and from 1971. Called the Flower Power radio by some folks, this J.C. Penney radio's real name is the Pound of Sound. We didn't see much style coming out of J.C. Penney in those days, but as with Panasonic, the tumultuous 1960s seemed to shake something loose in their buttoned-down worldview, at least for a while. Here's a terrific shirt-pocket radio that has no brand name on it anywhere. Maybe it's a little shy on branding because they stole the design. They stole it from, of all people, General Electric, one of the leading purveyors of the stale 60s designs just a few years earlier. These radios appear at first glance to have the kind of dial we call a slide rule dial. But it's actually not. What's really happening is there's a very large knob behind there that is half black and half red. Both radios are classics of the era, but the General Electric's conservative black color rather hides the fact, while the knockoff revels in it. Both were made in Hong Kong. We'll dive into more of these Panapet Era radios in future videos, if the numbers on this video show that anyone's interested. I have many more to show and share. As I say, most of the radio collectors I know have no use for them. But as I also say, I like them all.